BookTube, welcome back to my channel. Today is January 10th, which means that it's taken me 10 days to prepare this list of my favorite fiction reads of 2017, or my best fiction reads of 2017, or my most impressionable fiction reads in 2017. I'm not sure what this video is going to be called yet because most of these books were not published in 2017, but also they're not the books that I necessarily rated the highest during the year, because there were other books that I thought were probably more flawless while I was reading them, but their stories haven't stuck with me as much as these have. So these books that I'm going to talk about today are books that their stories I think will endure. These are novels that I have recommended to other people more often than any others. These are the stories that I think if you ask me about them 5 years from now, I'll still be able to talk for half an hour about each one. So these are probably the books that would probably kind of figure in like my classics list from books that I read. And they're not in any particular order until we get to the last two. First on my list is Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi. This is a story that starts off in Ghana in Africa, and it follows two sisters and how when their lives separate, the different experiences that each sister has. One sister stays in Africa, and so through following her story we get to see the impact of colonialism and what the European settlers do when they come to that country. The other sister is sold into slavery, and to follow her story is to experience the Middle Passage and slavery and emancipation and segregation and discrimination and the Jim Crow movement and Black Power and the repatriation. And the brilliance of this book is to see those two stories diverge but also come back together. Fascinating. And if you haven't read this one yet, of course, I recommend that you pick it up. Next on my list is Lincoln and the Bardo by George Saunders. This one is experimental fiction at its best. It tells the real-life story of Abraham Lincoln, President Abraham Lincoln's son Willie, dying while Lincoln is in the White House, and about Lincoln mourning his loss. However, it borders on the supernatural by introducing this idea of the Bardo. When Lincoln comes to visit the body and he becomes this medium between the living and the dead, he provides an opportunity for these souls to escape the enslavement of purgatory. And so the brilliance of this book is that it links this idea of Lincoln freeing his son from the enslavement of purgatory with the idea of Lincoln freeing the slaves from physical slavery during the emancipation that Lincoln was instrumental in achieving while he was president. It links these two ideas of personal slavery with political slavery, because the story is one that will stay with you for a really long time, I think. Next on my list is The Luminaries by Eleanor Catton. This book also won the Man Booker Prize. It is one of the biggest books that I've ever read. It's 800 and something pages. And I still am not sure how to categorize this book, except it's a book that I'm still thinking about. It is kind of historical fiction set in New Zealand during the gold rush period of the 1800s, and it follows these characters as they relate to a significant event that has happened. They're all involved in the gold prospecting business, but the story isn't centered around that. It also weaves in the idea of the zodiac, weaves in these characters and otherworldly influences into a story that is at once kind of supernatural but astrological in the same way. There are a lot of 12s in this book. There are 12 main chapters. There are 12 kind of main characters, and there is discussion of the planetary influence on the individuals and their interactions with the other characters, but also in some of the events that happen. It is complex and complicated, but also very rich and ornate, and you will feel better just for having read this book, even if only to say that you read it and you understood it and you hated it. You probably won't hate it. You probably love it as much as I do. Next on my list is The Buddha in the Attic by Julie Otsuka, and this is a novel that is told in a series of linked short stories. It tells the story of these Japanese women who come as mail order brides to the United States in the early 1900s. So in the period when there was only subtle racism and discrimination towards these Japanese immigrants, and not the suspicion of all-out treason that they were accused of when the war actually happened. The brilliance of this book is that it's narrated in first person plural, so the reader can't help but identify with what these Japanese women are experiencing as they transcend optimism and reality to the experiences that pushes them away from their homes, and see them experiencing the loss of their family members and friends being arrested for treason and deported. And it is a haunting story of real life events, and probably one that will stick with me and will stick with you if you read this book. Shylock Is My Name by Howard Jacobson is the first book that I read in 2017, and I'm still thinking about it. So this tells me that this is a book that will probably endure in my memory for a long time. This was Howard Jacobson's retelling of William Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. In the original play, Shakespeare's character Shylock embodied the stereotypical characteristics that we ascribe to Jews. So he is very focused on money, shall we say that. In the retelling, Jacobson introduces a second character called Strulovich. So there are two Jews, Shylock and Strulovich, and their interaction with each other also shows the difference between the different branches of Judaism. So while there's discussion of Jew versus Christian, there's also the discussion of Orthodox Jew versus secular Jew. And I think that added a level of complexity to this book and the discussion of religion that made this book a cut above the rest for me. I gave Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's Americana, I think, a 4-star rating when I read this book. But it's one of my favorites of the year. In this book, we meet two characters, Ifemelo and Obinze. We meet them as teenage students when they become a couple, and we get to see their relationship transcend friendship to romantic involvement and some of the things that entailed while they were living in their native Nigeria. Then they immigrate. One stays in Nigeria for a little while and then moves to England, and the other one comes to the United States. And so the story provides a comparison between immigration in the two different countries, but also the different experiences that two genders could have as they move to these different countries. I think maybe the reason that I didn't rate this one as highly as other people have is because I was disappointed in the end. I was disappointed with the way the story ended because I had connected so deeply with the character. That's no fault of the writing. That's just me being disappointed because my life, the life that I'm having in this book, didn't pan out the way I wanted it to. But this is one that I think will endure because she captured the experience of the immigrant in this present day. This book almost feels like a time capsule that will preserve this experience for the next generation. To read Jamaica Kincaid's writing, I think, is to step inside of her head and her heart for a moment. Most of her books seem to have this autobiographical quality, which she takes her experiences and novelizes them. Mr. Potter, I think, is no different, and it's about the real-life experiences she had growing up as a child in the West Indies, being raised by her mother, not knowing her father, to have a relationship with him. Even though she knew who he was, he didn't seem to claim her, and he didn't want to talk to her. But when she grew up and moved to the United States, her father died, and she had an opportunity to go back to the West Indies and eulogize him. Mr. Potter, the novel, is about that experience. The father in this novel is illiterate, and so he doesn't leave a written record of his life, his memories, his thoughts. But the narrator, as a writer, now has a chance for the ultimate revenge. Like, you didn't want to talk to me when you were alive, but here, I'm going to write your story. And so she writes his story the way she wants him to be remembered. The enduring quality to this book is the storytelling ability that Jamaica Kincaid uses. It's kind of like when you're going on a trip. No matter where your trip is going, every time you leave home, you have to pass the same roads as you exit your community. Her storytelling technique is to repeat sentences and phrases almost ad nauseum. But every time she repeats them, she adds a little bit extra to the idea. So it is like taking a trip, and every time you leave home, you have to pass the same roads in your community before you can get to the new uncharted territory. That alone, I think, makes this book enduring for me. But also, she chronicles the West Indian experience, the depth and breadth of what it truly means to grow up in a rural community and have some of those experiences and relationships that she talks about. So this is one of the books that stand out in my mind. Harvest by Jim Crace is about a group of sharecroppers in rural England and about their experiences when they learned that the farm that they have been spending their entire lives and earning their livelihood on is about to change managers and how they deal with the arrival of newcomers in their midst. It is a story of the pastoral experience, but it's also an allegory for how we treat immigrants and the political and geographical boundaries that we set up in our society and how we either respect them or whether we should. The book was very symbolic and used a lot of religious ideas, but what gives this book a lasting quality is a discussion on immigration and refugees and how we treat newcomers, but also how we change in relation to those experiences that we have. Human Acts was Han Kang's novelization of a real tragedy that happened in South Korea in the 1980s when a group of students protested the change in government. The government declared martial law and a still unknown number of students were killed. Each chapter in the book is written from the perspective of a different victim and at a different time. It was haunting and hard-hitting and emotionally gripping, but what makes this book particularly memorable for me was the attitudes that the characters seem to have about taking responsibility for the changes in their country, in their government, an individualistic as opposed to a patriotic one that I'm probably more used to reading about. Also, the way that the author told the story from very different lens, even from the perspective of one of the victims after he'd been killed, really portrayed the horrors of the killing and makes this one stand out in my memory. And one of my favorite novels for 2017 was A Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki. This is a dual narrative, split perspective novel, and it follows now. She's a teenager in Japan. She writes her diary about the anxiety of growing up in Japan, living amongst teenagers who bully her, and having a relationship instead with her old grandmother. And her novel is washed up on a beach in Canada and found by a woman who's a novelist. As Ruth explores Now's diaries, she becomes obsessed with the idea of finding out whether Now survived the tsunami or whether she survived her own suicidal tendencies. And so this novel becomes an exploration of uncertainty and a look at the quantum mechanical idea of time. The enduring quality for me with this book was definitely the way that the author talked about time and manipulated the quantum theory of time and introduced it in a very relatable way. Definitely makes this one stand out in my memory, and it is one of my favorite books of 2017, but also probably one of my favorite books of all time. And now here's a look at my other memorable reads from 2017. I don't read a lot of series in general, but I did start the Neapolitan Novelist series by Elena Ferrante, and I've read the first 3 books, and I have the 4th book to read in 2018. And so that is my favorite series. The longest book that I read is definitely the Decameron, which clocked in around 930 something pages after you add in the appendices and the introductions to each chapter and the forewords and all of that. And I talked about that at length. I read a lot of short story collections in 2017, and my favorite, I think, is The Thing Around Your Neck by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I gave that copy away, so I no longer have it. But another short story collection that I read that I recommend quite often is Things We Lost in the Fire by Marianna Enriquez. And this one is about the attitudes towards women and how women are perceived in different ways in different parts of the society. And there's a very haunting story in here, which is a title story, which is about how sometimes women respond to violence by being violent themselves because it is a way to take back the power from the other people who might try to control us. It was a very memorable story and one that I talk about quite often, so I couldn't not mention it here. So that's it. Those were some of my favorite reads of 2017, but also some of the books that I'll probably be talking about for years to come. So some of my most memorable reads of 2017. Thanks for watching this video. Leave me a comment down below if you've read any of these and you want to talk about them. And until next time, happy reading. Bye.